Welcome to the continuance of the Tuesday, January 8th, 2013 Board of Education meeting. The board has been in closed session since 6 p.m. this evening to discuss pending litigation and student residency. So let me also ask for, we have 7 members present, none absent. And with that, let's recite the Pledge of Allegiance.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Next section is public comments. I do not have any cards indicating that there's anyone here that would like to speak. Am I incorrect? Hearing none, then we can move on to Superintendent's communication. Mr. Pernot.
Yes, we thought we'd spend a few minutes this evening talking about some assumptions related to our enrollment projections for the 2013-2014 school year, and some of the recommendations from the administration based on our information to put together a budget, initial budget process that you will receive at the January 22nd board meeting. This is very early to try to do this kind of enrollment and staffing projections, and that'll be the caveat to the board right off the bat, that there are a lot of we're a long way away from the start of school for the 13-14 school year. And so we are making some assumptions on the best information we have at this point in the first week of January of 2013. This will allow us to get the budget process started, using those assumptions to build a budget model that PMA and Chris will present to you at the 22nd meeting. But we thought it'd be worthwhile to spend some time just discussing enrollment and the rationale for our recommendations for staffing for the upcoming school year. If the board is comfortable with that, then that would be the use of the assumption for the PMA projections, that you will see at the next board meeting. So let me start first by going through just a brief description of what we're seeing on enrollment. And again, this is early in the game, but this is kind of the enrollment projections we're looking at for the coming school year. Starting with York, we see a pretty flat enrollment increase at York. We're projecting a minimum number of 11 students who would be added to their present population at York, which is not a significant increase at this time. Now again, that's based on roll-up numbers and the projections that we see. That number can change, but that's our best information at the present time. Probably the biggest increase we're going to see is at the middle schools, and 2 middle schools specifically, Churchville and Sandburg. And that is because smaller 8th grade graduation classes are moving up to York, but large 5th grade going to 6th grade classes are coming into those 2 schools. So at Churchville, we're projecting an increase of 65 students at that building for next year. At Sandburg, we're looking at 57 students. And again, the majority of those are 5th graders moving to 6th grade and a smaller 8th grade class moving to York. Bryan is not as affected. Bryan, we're only projecting about 5 as a total increase. But as you will see in the staffing recommendations, that has a big effect on what kind of staff we're going to have to recommend going into those assumptions for next year. And then finally, at the elementary school, we are seeing flat, if not negative, increases at the elementary level for the coming school year. There are no significant increases at any of the schools, and as a matter of fact, the majority of the schools are seeing slight decreases. So we're projecting kind of a flat enrollment for most of the buildings. Now, the caveat always is that the elementary schools, because of the size of the buildings, you may see spikes in staffing depending on how the numbers come in for any one grade level. So depending on the number of students in one grade level, you could add a section late in the fall or late in July going into August because it puts you over the target amount. So that's kind of an unknown for us right now. But right now, we think there's pretty flat. We're projecting flat enrollment for the elementary schools. Again, the wild card here is kindergarten, although in the Cassandra projections, there weren't any dramatic increases in kindergarten enrollment for the coming school year. So that gives you kind of the background on the enrollment picture. Now, Meg Schnorr and Dr. Charles Johns are going to spend some time talking about the staffing increases that they are, again, potentially foreseeing for the coming year. Again, I'll go back. These are very early projections, but this is, again, based on the best information we know right now. And you're going to hear probably in 3 areas: the general education staffing, bilingual staffing, and then special education staffing for next year. So with that, why don't we start with Meg Schnorr, and she can walk you through the special education staffing numbers that she's seeing at the present time. Meg? Oh, you want to go first?
Can we go in order down?
Okay, that's fine.
So before I begin, I want to apologize. We had to correct the document that went out that was posted, I think, last night. That was an internal working document, and you should be looking at a memo that is actually collates those 3 together into one document. Basically, what we've done with this memo is broken down staffing into what I call non-discretionary recommendations, which means staffing that is necessary for to accommodate the number of students or to meet mandates by either ELL legislation or special ed legislation. So we felt that those were non-discretionary recommendations, and there's a little over 16.5 FTE in under non-discretionary recommendations. Meg and I, with our and our teams with work in the district, feel that there's a number of issues that need to be resolved either in the fairly short term or in the long term for if we want to attain some of our goals. And we place some staffing considerations that we think will help resolve those issues, but we've placed them on, I believe it's page 4, under what we list as discretionary or considerations for the future. And then there's a cushion piece of that we would like to include to accommodate any last-minute move-ins that brings the total of potential FTE to 30, but under the non-discretionary, it's only 16 and a little over 16.5. So if I can start on the first page, and a little bit of a caveat. There are some reductions that are made in different areas. So if you took the line of additions of FTE and added them up, they will not come to 30. But there are some places where there is an add in one place, but there is an offset that brings it back down to 30 that we did not put in this document. Arguably, the first thing under elementary teachers mainstream where we put in a 0.84 FTE is that we do have a reduction of a section at the elementary level, which we could then have a reduction in FTE for elementary, but we have found that with just the addition of a 0.84 of non-core FTE, we can restore the minutes that we took away from elementary music last year. I'm sorry, some of the minutes that were lost to elementary music last year, world language, and to minutes that were lost to art maybe in the 3 years prior to last year. So we can kind of start to return to the academic program that we had in the non-core. We also find that the teacher time is much more efficient because we have less traveling taking place, and we believe that we can enable more teacher grade level meeting time, which the teachers have really pointed out to us they could really use this year. Below that on mainstream teachers is middle school, and you can see what Dave talked about. We have an additional 30 sections in middle schools next year, and we believe that that's going to bring us to 5.6 core content teachers, and sorry for the extensive decimal points, 2.334 non-core teachers. Mr. Welton likes specificity, so we have to carry it out to the 3rd digit. So that brings middle school for mainstream teachers to 7.934. So Meg can outline special ed.
This is on the second page. Flip over the page that Charles gave you. It's no surprise with the increase in student population at the middle school level that we're going to see an increased need in resource special education services, which are special ed students who require 20% or less of their day in special education. We are going to need more teachers, special ed teachers, particularly on the north end. When the students on the north end qualify for special education, they typically qualify at a level where they have a significant number of minutes needed, whether the student is special education and bilingual or simply a special needs student. Moving down to the instructional special education classroom, the students that we're getting from the Early Childhood Center are the students that we're seeing are lower than the students that we've had in the past, and that's requiring us to staff at a level. Instructional level is a student who receives special education services 20 to 60% of their school day, and we're seeing a lot more students coming to us with that significant level of need. A section such as the one that I'm proposing for next year was already added this year at Jackson. And Jackson takes students from all over the district who may need that level of programming. This kind of programming is also offered currently at Field as well as Jefferson. Field is able to provide students with instructional programming in grades K through 5. Jefferson is also able to provide that at K through 5. Currently at Jackson, we only have it K through 3. So students would have to switch schools, and we're seeing the numbers as well as we don't like to have students switching schools once we start them there. We like for them to be able to have a home even if that is not their boundary or neighborhood school. So that's the reason for the increase. So that's at the elementary level. The number of students with autism, we all know that that's increasing at a dramatic rate. The biggest spike, when we started to see a spike in autism births or students born with autism, started in the mid to late 1990s, particularly 1997. Those students who were born in that year are now sophomores, and we are starting to see that spike at York, requiring us to need a 1.0 autism specializing teacher in the TLS program. 0.5 teacher of the deaf at York. We have students who are not only deaf but are also experiencing cognitive disabilities, which means for them to have a meaningful benefit under the law, we have to have a teacher of the deaf who can actually teach them how to read. I'm sure that you can appreciate how difficult it must be to teach a student how to read when they cannot hear. So that's why we need somebody specializing in that particular position. Speech-language pathologist, the state maximum for caseload for speech pathologist is 60 students. There's what's workable and what's legal. We are tipping the point at both the workable as well as the legal limit with regard to our caseloads in speech. The social worker for the self-contained programs. This past year, we added a section of autism at Hawthorne to address the needs of students in grades 3 through 5. So we now have autism programming self-contained for kids in kindergarten through 5th grade. However, we did not add the sections of social work. We were going to try and do the best that we possibly could with the current level of social work help that we have. So we added that section this year, as well as the section of instructional at Jackson with no additional social work help. So next year, we're predicting another instructional classroom as well as a self-contained classroom at York for students with autism. And if you have any knowledge of autism at all, you know that those students have a high need for social skills training and scripted social interaction and the expertise of a social worker, quite frankly. So we are requesting 1.4 social workers, or recommending 1.4 social workers to address the needs of students in instructional programs.
Next on Meg's list is the special education assistants. Those were not included in the totals that I gave you at the beginning of this conversation. We were just limiting what we were talking about to teacher full-time equivalencies.
The other reason why we can't really tell you about how many aides, this is very conjecture-based, we have more than 1,000 special education staffings that will take place between now and June. So if you can understand that this is very fluid and truly a crystal ball type estimate.
Then on page 3, we have English language learners, where we have a combined request of 2.1 FTE. We've come a long way with our ELL program this year. I'm really proud of the gains we've made. But as the diversity of the needs of our ELL, or English language learners, grows and expands throughout the district, we need to be able to provide educational experiences for those kids that meets their needs. It's incumbent upon us to have bilingual staff who can provide bilingual training for those who are at the lowest level of English proficiency. So at the elementary level, that would be an additional 1.1 FTE, so we can offer full range of services at the different schools. At the middle school, that would be a 1.0 FTE. Just as a foreshadow for the future, eventually York is going to need additional staffing as well. We didn't put it on this list for this year, but certainly that is, as this growing population comes through our district, it's going to extend into the high school. So this will be an addition to our list in the near future. Okay, if you turn to the top of page 4 is where we start sharing for you discretionary staffing considerations. And there's a number of things going on in the district and in the profession that are having a real impact on our effectiveness. And as Meg and I had conversation, and David had conversations on how we can be as effective as we want to be, reach the KPIs as soon as we want to. There are some things that we need to address in the district that will enable us to get there at a specific pace. And so the items we're about to go through are discretionary, but they will impact the pace at which we reach some of the objectives we know that are that we want, the community wants, and we feel the schools want. So these are discretionary, but we think that this has a real impact on where we're headed in the future. And so it might not be something that you feel that we want to go down, a path you want us to go down this year, but it is something we definitely need to consider in the future more and more seriously each year as we proceed. So Meg, you want to do the special ed?
The first one on the list is the 2.0 FTE school psychologist. This mirrors the recommendation for the school social worker in that we added a significant number of sections of self-contained programming for our most significantly disabled students last year, and we'll be adding this year. One of the reasons why we opened the programs, it's actually twofold. We like to keep the students in Elmhurst so that we can provide for them and not send them out of their district where we have very little control and very little oversight of their programming, as well as the fact that the outside tuition is extremely expensive and is only increasing year after year. So one of the things that the outside placements provide to our students is additional psychologist help. So that's part of what we're paying through that tuition. And by not paying that tuition and not sending those students out, best practice would be to provide them with that same level of support, and that would include additional psychologist help. Additionally, in the district as a whole, we're seeing a phenomenon where our students with limited English proficiency are being referred for special education evaluation, and not speaking English is not a disability. However, there isn't really a lot of avenues because of what we've been doing in ELL lately to get students help other than referring them for special education. And it's completely inappropriate, and over time, we may be cited with a disproportionate number of students who speak languages other than English being referred for special education. One of the ways to remedy this is to have better identification of students who have disabilities and better processes in ELL, which is what Charles has been working on with his team. We would be seeking out Spanish-speaking school psychologists because that's one of the areas that we definitely need to address. I think that covers the school psychologist, Charles.
Okay, the next item is the career technology support positions. David Smith's department, and David Smith and I and our departments for the past year and a half have focused very closely on expanding and strengthening the technology that's used for instructional purposes in the district. And we've got a long ways to go, and I think we've come a long ways, but we're still not caught up to where we feel our students are getting maybe the comparable technology experience that some of neighboring districts get. And this is a concern of ours, and we've made plans to address it as rapidly as possible, but we have a ways to go. If you turn to page 5, there's a table, and last year we had a survey of our teachers about technology and instructional technology use. And what we have here, I just saved the two highest levels of reporting that we got from the teachers about use of instructional technology. And right away at the top, they're telling us, they made it very clear to us that they need more professional development in classroom technology. Right now, the district has one person who's responsible for the technology for all schools in the district, the instructional technology. David has a team of I forgot what you call it, David, boxes and wires type people who manage the servers and handle the equipment and make sure the hardware is operational, but we only have one person that helps expand our use of instructional tools that are available. And this person is responsible for professional development to move us forward, but at the same time, just-in-time delivery as well. And she is also responsible for training on operational tools. So we use an assessment tool called Mastery Manager. She's there teaching teachers how to use Mastery Manager. And when there's a breakdown with this tool, she's the one who's helping teachers get through it. So we're putting an awful lot of really critical service needs in the back of one person, and it is a huge challenge. At the same time, we know that we have digital textbooks coming down the pipeline where it's an opportunity. We might be able to save costs for ourselves or our families by no longer using physical textbooks, but by using e-textbooks. We've been trying to get a one-on-one computing to take place at York. We know more and more districts in our area have one-on-one computing all the way down into the middle school ages. And then with the technology that we have, we still know that we need more training. We've got a huge infusion of smart boards in the district. We want to make sure there's adequate training so that we can get the best value out of those that we can. So David and I and Kathy Baker, who is the coordinator for instructional technology, we have put together what we feel is a pretty slight plan for how we can address this with an additional infusion of 4.0 FTE. Now, this isn't something we vetted heavily with other leaders in the district. With the short time frame that we had, we put this together as a solution. I don't think it's the end run solution. And an example of how we might do this is to put a person at York, one person to cover the middle schools, and one person to cover the elementary. Just to give you a point of reference, there are many districts that have one person at every building who is a full-time equivalent, whose role is to be there to support and to provide professional development for teachers in classroom technology. And as we move into new textbook purchases and some of the other tools that are available to us, there's more and more technology. So we're looking at a new social studies textbook, and it is full of technology options for our classroom teachers, but they need help in getting that integrated in their curriculum and how to access it and use it effectively and all the other things that are available to them. So there's a fairly lengthy justification for why this is important, but I'd also like to note something that David found out in a recent meeting he had. That's that first paragraph under this bullet, which is at his DuPage County Technology Coordinator meeting. There's only 3 districts of all the 25 districts in DuPage County that don't have building-based instructional tech support at some level at the building, and those are districts smaller than ours. So it really is an area that we feel we need support in the long run or longer run if we're going to keep pace and be able to offer a full set of services for our students. The next position that we have listed, which is on page 6, and this is something that Meg and I have talked about very recently, and it has not been vetted by administrators outside of cabinet. When we step back and look at all the demands and all the stresses that are occurring in the buildings, we feel that the building principals need support at the elementary level. And much of this comes from some of the new incursions or responsibilities that they now face, and primarily is the teacher evaluation process. So I haven't done the math real quickly, but you can easily see in a single formal observation that a single one, that a principal will have to commit 5 hours of time. And if you have an elementary school of 26 staff, that's a couple weeks worth of work on evaluations, and they do more than one evaluation. Then they have to do informal evaluations, and then they need to have meetings where they write up these evaluations and observations into a summative evaluation. And then you have to manage all of these meetings and observations, and it is an incredible drain on their time, and that's pulling them away from other things that need to take place in the building.
One secretary.
What's that? And they have one secretary to help them manage. Additionally, I think I'm on page 7. We're asking principals and their teams to do much more data analysis to really fine-tune and hone the quality of our curriculum program, to improve the quality of our RTI program, and that leads into special education. And so we have more and more meetings and more data that principals need to consider with their teams in order to make the right decisions. But sadly, the principals are already so burdened with the new requirements for teacher evaluation and observations. So as you can see, the number of meetings that the principals need to conduct in a given month is incredible. And I suspect we didn't include quite a few of the district level meetings that we asked them to come to. And this doesn't even get us into district and state level testing. And I think we missed one up there, Meg. Principals are really critical in setting up their buildings for MAP testing, Ames Web testing, ISAT, and the park assessments that are coming down the road are going to be a massive infusion of things that principals need to take care of. Principals also oversee 504 plan eligibility and write-ups. And you saw at I believe it was the last board meeting, the Rising Star school improvement planning process. That is likely to become the default for the state for all schools. And that could easily take, I think Michelle ran the leanest version at Churchville, and that was 5 to 7 meetings. So that whole list that we showed you before is really just, and that process is not really supposed to ever end. So it's supposed to be continual, where principals are going to have even more meetings that they need to process through. So as Meg and I went around the district this year and kind of really got a sense of how some of these things are impacting principals, we haven't sat down and asked them if they're interested in this, but we really think we need to find a way to help them, because we think it's going to help the major goals of our departments down the road. That we really need more support for the building principals so that we can continue to refine and hone our curriculum. And it's going to have a huge impact on 504 plans and special ed eligibility determinations. So maybe not for next year, but we need to put this on the radar so that we have some solutions to help the principals down the road. And maybe by the time we come back to this, if it's not something we put into effect for next year, we certainly will have time with the principals to tune this up a little bit. At this point, it's probably more weighty than a shot across the bow, but it is something we want to draw attention to, that it is a problem that we would like to see addressed. So there is obviously more reading that can be done there in terms of that position as well. So under that discretionary, there, as I said before, there is 10 FTE that is something to consider and give weight to. And then there is the 16.5 plus a few tenths for that we feel is necessary due to mandate and class sizes, of course, student enrollment.
Are there any questions? Mrs. Hirsch.
Yeah, I apologize. I didn't get to read it as thoroughly as I would have liked to. But I'm not necessarily going to, I think I have a lot of questions about the kind of things that you're proposing. And it is funny for somebody who's been around, I haven't been around that long, but you know, before Dave was here, we used to have a tech person in each building. What we had, and then we eliminate, and then we bring back, and sometimes we don't always understand the implication of the decisions we make. I've gone back and forth. I think, Dave, I've talked to you about this too in terms of the role of the school psychologist. And we added 8 school psychologists before, and now we're looking to add 2 more. And I agree that the Spanish-speaking component is something that we probably need to address within the district. But, you know, in doing some some research and understanding kind of the role of the school psychologist. A big part of the role of the school psychologist is to assist with the RTI, to assist with teachers' understanding and delivery of services in the classroom. And I'm surprised that we're looking to add the TOSAs to support. It seems like there's a lot of overlap between those areas of responsibilities. We also used to have assistant principals at our two largest buildings. We had assistant principals at Lincoln, and we had, for a while, and we had assistant principal at Hawthorne. And I can't imagine assistant principal being needed at Edison or at some of our smaller schools. I agree that there is disparity in terms of workload for those administrators, and I think that it is something that we should look at. But I wonder about the role of it being a teacher, a TOSA, you know, in terms of a longer term type of assignment, union membership versus somebody who's an administrator. I have a lot of questions about a lot of these proposals. So I guess, you know, I don't have a specific question that I'm going to ask to have answered, but I think a lot of discussion needs to go on around the types of additions that are being proposed. So I'm not sure how, or if you want to try to respond, but there's some concerns here that I have in terms of choosing the roles and those kind of things.
We're not asking you to act on the non-discretionary this evening, so let me throw that out there right away. What we were trying to do this evening is give you some what-if scenarios for additional staffing of what those may look like. Again, we haven't had time to go back to our administrative team or staff to talk about these concepts of the non-discretionary. But we wanted to give the board tonight kind of an indication of where the extra staffing, if we were at that point, where that extra staffing may go. So that was the purpose tonight. What I would recommend the board to do tonight is decide if you're comfortable with the assumption on the non-discretionary staffing, the ones that we think were required. If you're comfortable with that, I would direct Chris Welton to then build the PMA projections based on the non-discriminatory. The discretionary staffing we would hold, do some further work, do some further definition. Again, we haven't had a lot of discussion on these because of the short timeline. And then, depending on the board's comfort level on when you see the full budget and all the implications from the PMI, then if there is some leeway on further discretionary spending in the budget, then we would come back with more defined and priorities of where that is. But we're not prepared to do that tonight. So the purpose this evening was just to give you kind of a preview forecast of where that discretionary funding for staffing may be going. There's also, what we haven't talked about, and we will, is discretionary funding and expenditures on other related issues. For example, strategic planning related to the key DPIs. We have not put any money in the budget for that. Obviously, safety and security that has come up since December is also an area that we haven't addressed right now. We haven't had time to discuss that. That may or may not be additional expenditure of resources for that, but it's something we need to, you know, spend some due diligence on to explore what we're presently doing and how effective we are. So again, tonight, I think what we're looking for from the board is to say, are you comfortable with the assumptions on the non-discretionary staffing? Have Chris put those in the PMA projections and then move forward from there for the January 22nd meeting. And then you would have an overall picture of here is the status quo kind of budget that we're looking at for the 13-14 school year.
Mrs. Ebner?
I had a question about, under non-discretionary, the mainstream teachers for elementary school. On our report cards, I haven't looked at this in a while, you know, a month or two. On our report cards, we would have minutes, core minutes for math, science, social studies, language arts. Some of those minutes were below the state average. So are we going to get those core minutes up? We're talking about minutes for music and elementary world language. What about the core minutes?
You know, I'm going to have to double check my own thinking on this, because I thought with this year's report that we had drawn within the state average, but I need to double check that before I say it with absolute certainty. But certainly this would give us, this actually gives us some time to take care of some issues within the entire buildings a little bit. So.
In this year's teacher's contract, we, at the elementary level, we added 15 minutes a day of instructional time by those core teachers, right?
Yeah, I guess the report card comes out in the October, and it's from the previous year, so, okay.
You know, if I can, just so that it doesn't, I want to reiterate that first 0.84, although I list it under non-discretionary, in fact, it really is discretionary. It is just highly advantageous and I think more efficient and effective use of time.
May I ask a question about that? For just 85% of one teacher, you can add all those minutes back in all those schools?
It is really surprising, but it's true. It seems to be true. We have so many teachers where they have to travel between buildings, and we lose so much time in that travel that with just a little bit of time here and there, we can recoup some of that time.
Well, that's Mrs. Deroni.
This is very good information. As you were reading through it, I'm thinking, we need that. Yeah, we need that. We get down to the discretionary ones. Well, that's not just a wish list. Those are things we really need in order to, I mean, with all the things that have happened to our principals in the last couple of years, with the demands being made on their time and the increased special ed and all the IEP meetings, I mean, we heard about that for years, and now we have, 3 times the teacher evaluation time or 5 times the teacher evaluation time that's going in. I don't even know how you'll do it with 4 extra teachers on special assignment to help the principals. I mean, they all ought to have assistant principals to help with that. But how do we possibly add between $1 million and $1.5 million to the budget? I don't know how that happens. It's like the magic ball, Chris. What are we going to come up with? What is going to have to go? It strikes me programs are going to have to go. I don't know how you're going to do it. I'd be real interested to see, but I am fully supportive of both the discretionary and the non-discretionary wants that you've listed here. It's like I say, I don't see any wish listing going on in there. If we want to do what we say we want to do and bring these DPIs up and do all the things we want to do on that chart that everybody's going, rah, let's do it, this is minimal to me. So good luck. Part of the dilemma we have is we know that this is very costly. A lot of these proposals are very costly. And in realistic terms, given the economics and the budget and expenditures versus revenues, it's probably not going to happen in the short term, certainly. But I think we still have an obligation. We can either stop talking about it and not even discuss it, or at least start having conversations so that if funding becomes available by some miracle that's coming up and we realign some things within the district to free up funding to do some of these things, then we can compare and contrast what those are and maybe come back to the board in the near future and say, okay, we're going to save X number of dollars because we're going to eliminate this program because we don't think it's as effective as it should have been, and now we think it's better dollars for a benefit to go in this direction and try whatever that is. And so, we thought it was worthwhile just to get in front of the board for that kind of discussion tonight. I'm skeptical that we'll be able to fund a lot of this, just given what we're seeing and what's going to happen with pensions at the state. I haven't heard today, so I don't know where we finally ended up with that. But all those things are beyond our control that we're going to have to deal with. But again, I think it's worthwhile to start having the discussions of what ifs and how that affects our improvement process in the district. And so then if funding comes available, we are ready. And we can say, no, we've thought this out. It's been well vetted by all of the staff, bringing all the staff on board to have a consensus on where we should go and then going from there. So that was kind of the purpose of that this evening. But again, not recommending we put it in the PMA projections simply the non-discretionary staffing recommendations, I think, are kind of a given that we need to put in there.
Mrs. Gironi.
Just a follow-up, can we have like 2 different PMA projections, one with the non-discretionary and one with the discretionary? I mean, well, most of the FTEs are in the non-discretionary, right? There's what, like a third of them not in there. But when you see what's on that list, you think this is discretionary? I don't know. But if we could see, here's what we would do, here's the bare minimum we have to do, and here's what we really need to do, and here's what it's going to cost, just so we don't go along with the same programs that maybe aren't as effective, that maybe we should be looking at a little more critically in order to shift some dollars, shift some resources.
Mrs. Hirsch.
Actually, Dave, you had mentioned earlier, I believe if I heard correctly, that there's also a list of efforts or initiatives that we would like, that the cabinet and the administrative team wants to identify that are going to directly be related to the key DPIs that we're trying to focus on. So, in my head, it would be very difficult for me to look at a list of discretionary staffing separate from, and not include that in the list of the initiatives, the projects, the efforts that we want to focus on to try to affect those key DPIs. I think of it as we've got non-discretionary, okay, we've got staffing, we've got enrollment changes. Those things are things that we're going to have to take a look at. That's the first cut of PMA. But then, I would prefer not to look at 2 different lists in terms of TOSAs to support, the elementary principals. How do I weigh that against there's something that we want to do that is going to affect our special ed gaps? I really want to either see these mapped somehow to the key DPIs. Maybe it is just a generic overall, administrative overhead to try to operate the district more efficiently. But somehow I really, if we're going to draw a line and say this is the mandatory, this is what we have to carry, if there's anything discretionary, I would really prefer that we look at one list and we tie it to the key performance indicators, and this is our rationalization. This is what we're going to focus on for the year. This is what we're going to fund. This is what we're going to staff. I don't think that we can separate staffing from that list. I think that list has to be what we all agreed upon and what we said was going to drive us, and I think we should focus on that list.
Mr. Bloom.
I think the additional question for the board is, actually, let me step back. I mean, to all of your points, I think that if I understand this right, non-discretionary spending is a result of things that are mandated by state law or resulted from state actions, or are there to maintain current class size. That said, I think within those buckets, to Maria's point, there's still a significant dollars that are put into those buckets for that. So how are we making progress against the DPI's normal progress based upon the amount of money we're dedicating there, not the innovative piece that, that's some of this discretionary stuff that we're trying to go after. But, I mean, to your point, the TOSAs, that's the result of, Senate Bill 7 and a lot, and those are good things, but that's time that's legislated. We have to have these reviews in place by a certain time. I mean, we have to do this kind of stuff. So those are additional things that we don't have a choice in complying with these deadlines for these reviews and whatnot. And it will take away from the building time. It was something that didn't exist 2 years ago that does exist today, that is going to take out of the time of those administrators. And so, I mean, I guess, it's tough. To Susan's point, I don't see a lot of investment in growth and innovation in here. I mean, this is what we're spending to stay in place, to make kind of linear progress. So what that leads to is I think the direction that I think the board needs to give Chris and the budget, as they put the budget together, is what are the parameters for our P&L? And what are the parameters for our budget? Are you required to do as much as you can do with a zero balance, break-even balanced budget? Are we willing to consider some investments that may reduce our fund balance a bit, spend some of that fund balance, take a little more risk to make some investments? How much risk is that? I mean, I think that's the direction. If you talk about not necessarily having 2 separate budget versions, but coming up with one budget version, but you've got to give some parameters that say that, what do we want you to do in this budget? Well, we want you we want you to maintain legal requirements. We want you to keep class sizes, as close to the same as possible. We want you to make some critical investments in advancing some DPIs. And in order to do that, we're willing to give you some leeway in what that ultimate, balanced budget or not balanced budget is going to look like. Would we consider, something that's not a balanced budget like we did this year if we were making some of those investments and kind of what are those parameters? So I think that's the guidance. If we're going to have this, if PMA is going to come back and we're going to sit back down again and you're asking for their best case, I think we need to give them those parameters. So and I guess I would throw that open to the other board members as far as how much investment are we willing to make beyond a balanced budget to achieve some of this stuff.
Mrs. Durrani.
None. We have to balance our budget. I don't see how we can possibly start dipping into fund balances. It is a slippery slope. I would be absolutely opposed to passing a non-balanced budget, other than what happened this year, which was the money was there and it, got put in there because of the hospital business. But to start spending fund balances on programs and teachers is, in my mind, completely irresponsible.
Mr. Bloom.
And I guess I missed the second part of that, which is the budget necessarily is going to have a projected fund balance at the end of the year. We have an established range for our fund balance. The question is would we be willing to run a deficit as long as our fund balance stayed within the acceptable range that policy is set? And so I'm not proposing to spend into some risky area of fund balance. What I'm asking is that if our fund balance is at the high end of the range, at the end, as we've looked at it, we project at the end of the year our fund balance is at the high end of the range. Would we be willing to tolerate something more in the middle of the range that we've proposed in order to invest in some of these programs? And please don't take this as being advocating spending below what our minimum thresholds are.
Thanks for that clarification. That helps. I still think there are always unknowns that you do not know you're going to have coming down the pike, and that you want to have more than your minimum fund balance to a certain extent. And again, the question is what extent, I guess, is what you're asking. But, there's always going to be the hospital thing that's blowing up in our face, or the pension reform, or something else that if we want to keep this district in good fiscal order, we have to be a little conservative and see where else we can cut rather than spend down. That's all. You're making me very nervous. That's all. I'm okay now.
Go ahead.
And I guess one other point is just our view on budget cuts this year. And are we going to try to run a budget that, with whatever range you decide you're comfortable with, do we want to try to avoid any kind of position cuts at all costs for this year? Or what is that range where we're willing to maybe bend a little bit in order to preserve? So, if Chris runs the PMA projections, they come back and they say that it's unbalanced, are we going to come back and when we sit down next time and say, all right, we've got to make cuts, we've got to cut $500,000, we've got $1 million, in order to do this? Or, again, these are the parameters as he puts the numbers together and starts to, press the button on the flux capacitor. What he sees that comes out, is he going, we could be sitting here next meeting after PMA does this, not looking at discretionary, but looking at what are we going to have to cut. And so, are we to ask Chris to run a budget that's level? That just says, look, let's keep staff, let's do the staffing to maintain where we are. Let's try to avoid any staff cuts, any program cuts, anything else. We need to give them qualitative direction as he runs this model, so that what we get back out of this we don't have this discussion again, 2 weeks from now.
Go ahead, Mrs. Hirsch.
I think I'll be shocked if there's money in our budget. We've been saying all along. I don't want to dismiss the efforts that, the cabinet and the team put in terms of what we would like to invest in. I think those are very, very valid points. And at one point in my time here on the board, we cut some things, and we made some strategic investments, like putting a reach teacher in each building, because we thought those were highly leveraged resources that would really impact student performance. So we've been able to do that balance before. I think I would be very surprised, however, if there are discretionary funds in our budget. Now, maybe there's something that I've missed, but I don't know that, every financial discussion that we've had at this table has been our revenue's declining, our expenses are increasing. So I would be very surprised if we had a lot of discretionary money available to us. I do think that it is a very valuable discussion, however, to say if we are able, if we do as a board decide to either spend a little percentage of that buffer, okay, or if we do decide that this program, if the administration can come up with something that is not proving to be effective, and we either have a better solution for that particular problem that's going to take a little bit of incremental investment, or if there's something that we decide to stop doing and focus on something else. I think those are very valuable things to discuss. However, I still think that, you know, the flux capacitor has to run, and Chris has to come back and say, we're projecting, you know, assuming a balanced budget, assuming that our fund balances are within the acceptable range, this is the play area. This is how much, you know, space we anticipate we're going to have. But as Mr. Pernod said, legislature went home today. New legislature will be sworn in tomorrow. Mr. Madigan is still talking about, you know, even after the new legislature's in, which apparently he has even more power, that he could still move pensions to the district. We're not out of the woods yet. There's still a lot of unknowns. And so I'm very cautious. And I do really want to reiterate the link to our district performance indicators, that everything has to be tied to those. I think that's the only way for us to rationalize what it is that we're doing.
Can I throw in a comment here? I mean, one of the primary functions of a school board is to allocate our limited resources that we have for our students' educations. So this is the discussion that, as a school board member, I want to have. I appreciate that the administration has brought to us not only what we're doing now, but the possibilities of what we could do. So over an extended period of time, which we're starting early, that we can have that discussion. We can explore the possibilities of what can we trade off, what are our gains, what are our losses in those trade-offs. So I guess my question for the administration is what is, can you kind of lay out the time frame that we're under and what we can expect over the next few meetings, and in terms of, I mean, when I saw this list, my first question was, wow, what does all this cost? And the corollary to that is not only what it costs, but what would we have to trade off to achieve these different elements? And then, therefore, what is our time frame to go through that decision process?
Well, my take would be, and Chris may have a different take, my take would be that if the board's comfortable again with the non-discretionary staffing recommendations, we put those in the PMA projections. We look at that on January 22nd, and to me, that is the status quo budget of moving forward for next year. Not adding anything, not changing anything significantly, but having the same program and services with that. My first question to the board would be, as Chris brought up, I would like to avoid layoffs this year and riffing at all possible. So what does that number look like with these new PMA projections? I think that's the first question the board is going to have to face. And if it's a deficit budget going into next year with just the non-discretionary staffing included, is the board comfortable with looking at some fund equity being taken out to cover this year's costs so that you don't have significant decrease in programs and services? That would be the first question for the board, and I think you'll see what that number is on the 22nd. Then after that, it's a matter of, do we have any additional discretionary dollars, or the administration will have time then to vet and talk about some of these initiatives and where they fit in, either with additional funding or with a change of priorities and not funding something and adding funding to something else. Again, we have not had a lot of time to talk in depth with staff and administration about this. I need time to go back. I don't want this to be a top-down process for the staff that, you know, we're deciding what these are. And we just haven't had the quality time to sit down and do that. I think that's necessary. So I'm not even prepared. You know, if you would ask me at the next 2 weeks to come back with a list of the discretionary funding, what we're recommending, I couldn't do it because I'm not sure where those are, how those line up, what are we going to accomplish. And as Maria said, I think the first obligation is how does this affect our key DPIs, and how does that tie into the improvement process for the district on the goals that the board has established for the district? And so we have to tie those back in, and we haven't had that quality discussion either. So, but I think, again, I think the next meeting, you'll see the PMI projections for the status quo kind of budget, that's what I'm calling it, and see where we are. And is it going to take, is there going to have to be a consideration of going into the fund equity, and how comfortable is the board doing that, and to what level are you comfortable doing that? I think that's the first step.
And in terms of a timeline, the finish line is basically March, correct? Because that's when we have to decide what staffing levels. Right.
For certified staff.
Some of these aren't certified.
Right. But the biggest costs are certified. So.
But that's for cuts. So, I mean, if we're going to add people, you can add them whenever. I mean, I think we have to make that first decision on, are we going to run a status quo budget without cutting anybody? Well, if we can get to that point, we have to get to that point by March, but we have flexibility if we're going to add to go beyond that. Is that correct? Yes,
but if you're going to do some trade-offs between people are not completely interchangeable. So if you have to lay off some job titles to hire other job titles, or you have to decide that by March.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I should have asked, I don't know, Meg, predicting early childhood enrollment is kind of ridiculous, but because those kids are really, really young and they haven't been identified yet. But I know that our growth is huge. So do these status quo numbers, I know that we grew some. I think we added another section at Madison. I know we provided some ELL services at Madison. So can you just give us the spitball of, we're taking into account a similar growth path, or if we're expecting it to level off, or what assumptions have we built into what we're asking to run as a status quo in early childhood?
It's a similar growth pattern. The thing about early childhood is kids do leave early childhood, which opens up spots for students. You're correct. We did add a section in the fall as well as a section just this week. So, but that was actually built into the original budget. Susan and I had projected that. We're anticipating that we will be able to stay at status quo for next year because of the students who will move on to kindergarten. But that kindergarten, as we were saying earlier, it's a variable, because we don't always know what students are coming up. Again, our relationship with the Birth to 3 program is very strong, but that doesn't mean that all the kids who are going to come in are going to be going through Birth to 3.
Mrs. Stufen?
That actually leads to the very first question I had is, I wanted to clarify, it appears to me that this is considering elementary school, middle school, and York. It did not. Does it include the transition center, and does it include early childhood? Because I know our early childhood numbers have significantly increased every year and doubled in
Right.
10
I think we
years.
covered the early childhood piece, unless you had another question about that. But with regard to the transition center, again, we have some kids who will age out, and that's going to still stay between the 22 and the 26 that we had originally budgeted for both this year and next year. It's kind of like an osmosis thing. We have 2 or 3 come in and 2 or 3 move out. They also move out throughout the course of the year. It's not something where they stay until the end of the school year no matter what. Their cutoff date is the day before they turn 22, whether that's in February, sometimes it's in September, and they just come back to us for a month.
Okay, so that's kind of how it's kind of a net zero. Is that okay?
That's correct.
Okay, so I want to clarify that. Meg, when you were talking about the early childhood children moving into kindergarten, that would include the elementary school. So are those included in here?
Most of the students who would be coming out of the early childhood program would be either affected by the increase where I asked for additional resource help.
Okay.
Some of those kids who don't have a lot of deficits would be in that 0 to 20% of their day, as well as the addition at Jackson of an additional instructional program.
Yep, okay.
The program that we started this year can satisfy the needs of students in K through 3. So some of those students who are in 3rd grade would move into that 3, 4, 5 program, leaving more room at the kindergarten sections.
Okay. So you are looking at realigning staff as the children progress
Absolutely.
through our system. So that was another element that I wanted to make sure that we were clear on. Okay. my three basic things were linkage to DPIs. I think that's critical. As we move forward, we put a lot of effort into, how do we want to look at things bigger picture, and that determines what we do detail level. And so I would like to see kind of an overlay. Without belaboring the point, because we've talked about it, but that was a key point for me. And then the other piece is, with regard to the budget. I'm with Mrs. Deroni. I know that these are necessities. It seems as though that continues to be that way for the last at least 3 or 4 years. I'd like to see us do some visionary things, but how do we do that? Therefore, I think that it's healthy to have discussions of, what can we say we won't do, or we can't, we can delay it to do some significant visionary things, because we don't have extra money. So, Mr. Bloom, to your point about the status quo, I would entertain probably a small portion of fund balance, or, entertain a discussion about it if it were visionary things, not to do the necessity. I think that's bad practice. So I wanted to weigh in on that. And then I guess the last piece is, I know that we're talking about, I know that it's difficult to determine, but when we talk about increase in FTE, what portion of our population are we talking about increasing the cost in the district? And I don't know if you can answer that, but that's kind of how I look at it, because, if we don't start looking at it that way, we have this runaway train, basically, and, and we have all these mandates that we have to provide these services without the funds coming in. The funds are reduced. So it gets to the bigger picture discussions that we as elected officials will have to have hard discussions with. How do we maintain this without just saying we have to, continue on this path? I think to Dave's point, that this is very healthy discussion, to not ignore it, not, to have open discussions about how we're going to move forward in a productive way, increasing the results of our education system here in District 205 and maintaining our high level of results. But I think we have to also look at when we spend the money, when we add FTE, where is it? What populations? How are we affecting all of our students?
Let me present the board with this question. So from what I hear from the administration, I applaud them for starting this process early. Sounds like what we're going to do is we're going to hear as the administration refines their thinking. We're going to see different scenarios. Sounds like we're going to be talking about this at just about every board meeting between now and the end of March. And we're going to be looking at what the trade-offs are between all sorts of scenarios, and what we can do visionary and what that costs us in terms of other programs. What it costs to maintain the status quo, impact on class sizes, impact on the small reserves that we may have, and particularly that just to remind the board that our primary objective is to avoid any borrowing into the following year's budget. So our laser focus should be on that fund, on what we have in the bank on May 31st. That needs to be a positive balance. Otherwise, we're borrowing for the next year's budget, and that becomes a cancer, because you do it year after year and it gets worse and worse, and that is fiscally irresponsible. But given those parameters, are we comfortable with the process of an exercise in exploring trade-offs and exploring new ideas that the administration brings to us each meeting between now and March? Does that seem reasonable? Okay. Is there any other questions? Okay. Oh, Mrs. Ebner, sure.
Right. As we're going to talk about the status quo budget, but if we can also include what we did in the summer with the cabinet, the board and the cabinet, we did a retreat, and they talked about some of the transformational ideas that they had, if we can also continue discussions on some of those ideas, it might not happen in this next year, but start talking about some of those things too, that we reviewed in the summer.
Yeah, I agree. Please keep in front of us these ideas that take us to the next level. We always need to talk about them, whether we can afford them or not. It's...
At the 10-year facility plan, I mean, whether it's physical facilities, I think this is kind of the 10-year, these are the things that we would like to invest in. Here's our list. And it doesn't necessarily, we don't have to start from scratch every year and say, well, what are we doing now? But I think, hopefully some years we'll be able to bump some things up above the line and they'll get funded and we'll try to do those things. So I think that's a good concept of having, the 10-year project plan, initiative plan.
Agreed. Okay. If there's nothing else, then we'll move on to the next section of the meeting, which is upcoming meetings. And we're back to having quite a few between this month. So Wednesday, January 9th, the Performance Management Committee meeting will meet at 7 o'clock in this room. Tuesday, January 15th, the Finance and Operations Committee will meet at 6:30 in this room. Tuesday, January 22nd, will be our regular Board of Education meeting, where this topic will again be on the agenda in these three rooms. Tuesday, January 29th, is our Committee of the Whole Board Improvement Policy meeting, where we're going to have our 6-month update, the goals we set for ourselves last summer. We're just going to have a quick run through those goals. Are we on track? Is there anything that's off track? What do we want to achieve between now and the end of the fiscal year? And then Thursday, and finally January 31st, the Performance Management Committee will meet again at 7 o'clock in this room. The next on our agenda is the action item on closed session regarding student residency. Mrs. Hirsch.
Just a fair warning, it's a long resolution. Motion, yes, sorry. I move to direct the hearing officer in the student residency matter identified in the minutes of the closed session preceding the adoption of this motion to 1, reopen the hearing for A, receiving evidence regarding and giving consideration to the objections filed by the attorney for the student's family, B, hearing direct testimony from the student's parents, grandparents, and in the discretion of the hearing officer or the student, rather than through their affidavits or representations by their attorney. C, the weight, if any, to be given to the affidavits submitted by the family and information submitted through their attorney, if any of the family members do not testify directly. D, information regarding the occupancy of the home owned by the student's parents outside of School District 205. And E, such other evidence and arguments as either the family or the school district's administration wish to present as determined relevant by the hearing officer. 2, to present within 5 days after conclusion of the reopened hearing to the family, the administration, and the Board of Education a supplemental report to which the family may file objections within 5 days after receipt.
Second.
Moved by Mrs. Hirsch, and I will not repeat the motion, and seconded by Mrs. Deroni. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. That motion passes. Next on our agenda is board communications. Have we had any committees that have met since the last meeting? I don't believe we have. Is that? Mrs. Ebner, please.
The next curriculum and instruction meeting will be January 17th. It's a Thursday. And Charles is planning, we're planning mode for our ELL forum end of February. So there's going to be a lot of invitees. So it's taking a little while, but it's going to be worth it. And we'll solidify the date soon, but it'll be end of February.
So to add to our list of meetings, January 17th at 7 o'clock in this room, the curriculum instruction meeting, which was rescheduled from January 2nd. Okay. Mr. Bloom. In fact, Mr. Bloom, would you entertain a moment of silence for Notre Dame?
We edit that out.
Go ahead, Mr. Bloom.
Sorry, you mean the number 4 team in the country? I forgot what bowl Illinois played in. Anyway.
So did I.
Thanks a lot. Me too. Thanks a lot. Good basketball team, though. 2 things. The first one is I just wanted to give a heads up to everybody. As part of the liaison role at York, I was spending most of my time focused with a career development and counseling group. And one of the things that the resources I think we as a board can bring to bear is some of the relationships we have in the community with folks that are professionals in certain careers that can help the exploration process for these kids as they try to discern what they want to do with their lives. Amy Thompson is in the early stages of planning a STEM Career Week, March 18th through the 22nd. Very preliminary at this point in time. There will be, at some point in time, a request out for us to look through our Rolodexes and start to, hopefully identify professionals that can come in and give a few hours of their day in talking to these kids about what they do. And what I would like to emphasize is STEM's not, it's not all science and math, but there's so many different careers in which science, technology, engineering, and math touch. So, for instance, accounting, a lot of math, marketing. I mean, some of the consumer marketing and consumer products companies use a ton of math. Sports management, Moneyball. I mean, the statisticians and whatnot. So, showing these kids that there are more fun things than just doing math. But within science, athletic trainers, things like that. So, we're trying to define a very broad universe of careers and show these kids how math and science and technology are used within these careers. And how important it is to study that, within school too. But I just wanted to give a heads up that when Amy gets to the point in time, she's going to set up a website where volunteers can go, and we can send a link out at that point in time. But yeah, I will go ahead and tap all of you on the shoulder and ask for you to lend your Rolodex to this effort. I know they don't exist. I'm sorry, your Outlook contacts.
For a STEM meeting.
Yeah. Right. I should get into the 21st century.
Where's your iPhone?
Get your Outlook contacts out, and so we're going to be twisting some arms to try to really provide a good turnout on the career side. So I wanted to throw that out. Is one thing. The second thing is I talked to Elizabeth Hennessy today to get an update on the bond market, because obviously now the window's open now. Unfortunately, at the beginning of the year, bond rates have moved 30 to 40 basis points against us. Still better than they were in early December, but worse than they were when we looked at this last in November. So there's and I don't know, David, if she had rerun the savings chart for us. So I just wanted, just the first one for now. Yeah. So the one on the left, as you can see, their threshold for refinancing was 3% savings, and as you can see, this is 14.6% savings. So despite the rates moving, the update to everyone is that it still makes sense. Chris is going through the process of getting our rating updated, going through a lot of the procedural issues, the due diligence and whatnot, and being in a position to go ahead and issue this when all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. So that said, we also took a look at a second scenario, once again revisiting what if we refinanced everything. And part of the reason we looked at that is given some of the political risk with the sequester and deduction phase-outs and the impact that deduction phase-outs may have on the municipal market, because a lot of the buyers of municipal tax-exempt paper are higher income people that rely on that deduction of muni interest and their taxes, and to the extent that that gets limited, it starts to impact the demand for these securities. And so I had a question for Elizabeth and said, hey, first off, the difference between a tax-exempt and a fully taxable piece of paper at the short end of the yield curve, so a 2-year piece of paper, is 30 to 60 basis points, so kind of half a percent. So, and we're assuming that the deduction phase-outs aren't 100. I mean, you're not gonna get zero deduction for mortgage interest. So it's not 5 or 6% difference. So that was on the longer end of the curve. It's 1 to 2%. So there may be some material disruption in the municipal market if you start to get some of these deduction phase outs. But I think the belief of William Blair is that the market will stabilize. There'll be some initial kind of dislocation in the market. So one, I think there's a window here. There's some demand in January that we're going to want to jump through once we get everything ready to go. I just wanted to revisit. Just thought it was prudent to revisit maybe what happens if we did the whole thing to avoid maybe some of this risk. That said, if you look at the number, there's $3 million worth of savings, but there's $2.4 million of negative arbitrage, which that means we're investing this money in zero interest securities, but paying interest on the bonds that are still outstanding. So almost half of our savings is chewed up through negative arbitrage. Every day that number goes down because we have less of a time that this escrow is outstanding until the call date, which is 2015-16. In talking to Chris, I think Elizabeth's point of view on this was that's a big number for us. That her advice would be to stick with the plan, if I characterize that right, Chris. Again, it obviously concerns me taking political risk, and what might happen in Washington. But that said, it's a $2.5 million question. I think that the professionals have told us that that's a really big number to eat right now. So I think we were planning on going along with the legged plan unless we wanted to discuss changing our idea here.
Can we see the first one, Dave, again? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Dave. Can you just put them side by side? No.
May I also suggest perhaps one other thing to take a look at? The idea of issuing bank-qualified municipal bonds is what limits us to a total issuance of $10 million a year. Right now, that's worth between issuing bank-qualified municipal bonds would give us somewhere between a 30 and 60 basis point lower rate. So one option is that you issue your $10 million worth this year, and say in the month of January, but you issue them as non-bank qualified bonds. You actually pay a tiny bit more in interest, 30 to 60 basis points. But what you've done then is you've maintained an option if market conditions change severely during the course of the year, you've bought yourself an option that you could refinance the entire amount this year. By issuing bank-qualified bonds, you preclude yourself that flexibility of refinancing the rest of it at any point until January 1st, 2014. So that's just another scenario to consider, and I ask, is that a scenario that we'd like William Blair to run so we can see what the cost of that would be?
Yeah, that's fine. The only question and just doing this in the back of the envelope, 30 basis points on $6.6 million is about 20 grand annually on those bonds, and the savings is 80. So we can have them rerun it, but my guess is that's going to really dent the math.
It will, but then you have to just ask, what is that option worth? Because then you perhaps preclude yourself savings, of $2.5 million. I'm sorry, of what is that?
It's $3 million of present value savings. It's almost $5.5 million of savings, and then 2.5 of that is eaten up by the arbitrage. So again, I mean, you can take the $3 million on the table right now, but give 2.5 of it basically back to the government. Or, I mean, you can wait. And so we had decided not to make a call on interest rates and to do this on a leg basis, annually at a time. I get the risk, though. I'm with you, Jim. I'm worried and I'm concerned with the interest rates right now and the direction that they're headed. I'm concerned with the political risk on the deductions. That's why we had them run this second one. But we're giving up a significant portion of the benefit if you do this today. So it's a tough call. But
and all I'm saying is that you just price yourself out what that option costs.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, we can continue to look at that as we get closer. We're not at the point of pricing yet. I think Chris, I think that the earliest she's going to be ready is it's going to take at least a week, if not 16th or something like that. So we can continue to look at this and come back to the board should there be something material that needs to be discussed.
as we talked last year, there is a big there's a big technical bid in January and June of each year. So it does seem that we would get the best execution of the issuance of these bonds if we were to move in January. So if we want to look at any other scenario, I suggest we do it sooner the better.
And just to be clear, if we were to do that too, there would be a whole new set of resolutions that would need to come before the board at the next meeting.
Right.
And in talking to Elizabeth, they can continue to get ready and continue to be in a position to start to market. It may cost us a week in the market, so we have to deal with that. But what we decided was probably the most middle of the road approach. This would be just calling it and saying, you know what, let's go ahead and take advantage of it right now and just be done with it. I think
so. To forge down our current path, we're looking at the earliest date we'd be ready to go is something like January 16th. Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So, and again, I put a bit of weight into Elizabeth saying that her advice would be not to do the whole thing, because I was probably leaning more towards doing the whole thing after thinking about it for a while until I started talking to her and kind of maintaining the current course. So again, I wanted to throw that out there to everybody as we get down the road here.
Anything else under Mrs. Durrani?
I just wanted to find out what's happening with the intergovernmental agreement. I know you sent an email to us a week or so ago updating us what's happened since then.
What we're going to get, I've asked Mr. Pernod to get a conference call with our attorney to talk about other wording possibilities. After that call and after he comes up with some other wording possibilities, we'll submit that back to the city. And hopefully we can have a meaningful discussion with the city soon after that.
It just concerns me. This is really not going the way we thought it would. We thought by the end of September we'd have this intergovernmental agreement all wrapped up. We wanted to have it wrapped up before they even proclaimed the TIF 4, and now it's continuing to drag on. I wonder if it's a concern of any other board member and if there's what we can do about it. I mean, I know we're at the mercy of the city, but
again, there are several points in this intergovernmental agreement. We've made significant progress. We're in agreement on every single point except the language behind one point. And again, to point out that the way the TIF law is written, the city holds all the cards. And the fact that many cities wouldn't even entertain this discussion that they're having with us. And just in the best interest of the school children of Elmhurst, I'd just like, on this final point, as specific an agreement and precise wording as possible so that there's no confusion 10 or 15 or 23 years down the road about what was intended and exactly how it works. And, you know, the city's concerned about the language in there as well, that other taxing bodies would not object. And I think we just have to pick the right words that we can all agree upon. And that's the process we're in. Mr. Bloom.
And yeah, I think I would like to say, I mean, we're in agreement on all the points except this one, but I think we're conceptually, we're not that far apart on what we want to accomplish here. It's the language that's creating the issue. So, I mean, I personally, the aldermen that are friends of mine have not had any indication that they're backsliding on this at all. I mean, they want to get it done. We just have to get to the right language. It's been a lot slower. The holidays have kind of mucked things up a bit, but I mean, I'd like to just from my perspective say that I don't think that we've had any indication from the city that they're backing away from anything here.
Mr. McDonough?
So you'd say there's a clear commitment communicated by the city, although they don't want to make it a legal commitment, to provide the entire $6 million of TIF-eligible expenses for Churchville and Fisher capital improvements.
That is certainly the intent that's been communicated to us. you know, in each case, wrapped in just trust us. You know, we've never failed you before. We don't intend to fail you again. And we're just looking for some tighter wording than that. So that's where we're at.
I think that would be important, that expectation is clearly stated, albeit without the legal obligation, which I understand their reluctance to do.
Right. So is there a middle ground that is, and I mean, and their track record is very good. So we're just looking to tighten it up. And like you said, we need a middle ground between nothing and making every one of our expenses TIF eligible expenses. And there's somewhere in between there that I'm convinced we can meet. Mrs. Hirsch.
As part of the complete agreement with the city, we're also looking at the city cutting us a check for approximately $1 million, which we had discussions earlier tonight. It's not an ongoing, it's not an annual allotment of $1 million, but $1 million to our school district is a significant amount of funds that I'm quite certain that the cabinet administrative team could find a really good use for those funds for our upcoming school year. And so I would like to see this closed out as quickly as possible so that we have a better handle on what our total revenue base is and move forward. So I am all for expediting this as quickly as possible.
Mrs. Hirsch, I couldn't agree with you more. I proposed several times that we have an agreement in place before the TIF was even passed, but that's just not how it's gone so far. Mrs. Ebner.
The reason for the slowness is if we're supposed to come up with the language, this really hasn't been done. I don't know, has it been done before in other school districts? There aren't TIFs with schools in the TIF. So there's no language to fall back on, and if they're not going to come up with the language, so we have to come up with it, and we pass it to them, they don't like it, and this is treading new waters.
Exactly, and Mr. McDonough, far more of an expert on TIFs than I am, but I am going to guess that this is somewhat precedent-setting, what the agreement we're coming up with here.
It's not unusual for TIFs to fund school improvements. It's actually pretty common in the city of Chicago. I don't think this is a unique issue to find the wording that satisfies the expectations on both sides of the table.
If that's the case, then this would be going much faster. Let's get that wording then. Let's get that wording.
I'd love to see this finished very shortly.
I think we all would. The holidays are over. We're back on it. Mrs. Stufen?
So with that said, though, our plan is to close this out as quickly as possible. Now that there are no holidays, we're going to move forward. We're going to have the conference call with our attorney, get a second proposed wording, and if they don't like that, they're going to propose a wording that they're okay with so that we have something to work with.
We are always open to their proposal, to the city proposing wording that they're comfortable with.
But I'm trying to lay
always open to that scenario.
Right, but that's kind of how we're going to proceed, just so that I'm clear as to.
Yeah, I think you got it.
Okay.
Anything else on the subject of intergovernmental agreements? Anything else under board communications? And we have, Mrs. Hirsch. There we are. We have moved this all the way to 9 o'clock. There is a motion by Mrs. Hirsch to adjourn, a seconded by Mrs. Durroni. All in favor, say aye. Opposed, say no. Motion carries. We are adjourned.